My name is Nadia, I'm 38 years old, and on a Tuesday morning in October, I got a call from a hospital in Phoenix telling me that my father had suffered a massive heart attack, and that I was listed as his emergency contact. The first thing I felt was not concern, it was confusion, because my father had not spoken to me in 15 years, because I had not known he still had my number, because the last conversation we had ended with him telling me I was dead to him over a sum of money I had refused to lend, and because the idea that this man had kept me as his emergency contact for 15 years of silence was the kind of detail that required sitting with before it could be understood. The second thing I felt, about 30 seconds after the confusion, was something I can only describe as clarity, the particular clarity of someone who has spent 15 years building a life without a person, and who understands immediately upon hearing their name again that the building is complete and the foundation is solid and whatever is about to happen is not going to touch what she has made. I told the nurse I would be on the next available flight. I booked it from my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me, and then I called my lawyer, not because I knew yet what I was walking into, but because 15 years of silence broken by a hospital call had the particular shape of a situation that was going to require me to be prepared, and preparation had been my default mode since the day my father told me I was dead to him, and I decided to take him at his word and build accordingly. I landed in Phoenix 18 hours later, and walked into a situation that was exactly what I had suspected and worse than I had imagined. My father was in the ICU, unconscious, stable but critical, and his two sons from his second marriage were waiting for me in the family consultation room with a folder of documents and expressions that told me they had been waiting for 3 days and had rehearsed what they were going to say. What they had not rehearsed was me. If you have ever been cut out of someone's life and then called back in when they needed something, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because this story is about what happens when the person they discarded spent 15 years becoming exactly the kind of woman they should have been afraid to call. And it is just getting started. My father's name is Robert Okafor. He is 67 years old. He came to the United States from Nigeria in 1982 at 22 years old with a degree in engineering and the particular determination of someone who understood that the margin between the life he wanted and the life that would happen by default was entirely a function of how hard he was willing to work. He was an excellent engineer and a difficult man, two things that coexisted in him without apparent conflict for as long as I knew him. He built a career that was genuinely impressive and a series of personal relationships that were genuinely destructive, and he seemed to experience no particular dissonance between the two. My mother was his first wife. They married when he was 26 and she was 23. She was a nurse from Lagos who had also come to the States for her education, and who had the warmth and the patience that Robert lacked and that I inherited entirely from her side. They had me when he was 28 and divorced when I was 7. The divorce was not gentle. My father experienced my mother's decision to leave as a betrayal that he never fully processed, and that colored every interaction he had with her for the rest of her life, and with me for most of mine. I grew up primarily with my mother in Columbus, Ohio. I saw my father on the schedule the court established and then on the schedule he kept when the court-ordered schedule became inconvenient, which was intermittently and unpredictably. He remarried when I was 9. A woman named Gloria, who was 25 to his 37, and who produced 2 sons in quick succession. Marcus, who was born when I was 10, and Jerome, who was born when I was 12, and my father's attention, which had always been partial and conditional, redistributed itself around his new family in a way that left very little for the daughter from the first one. I want to be fair about my father because fairness is how I was raised by my mother. Even when fairness was hard, he was not entirely absent. He paid his child support consistently, which I know because my mother told me so and she was scrupulously honest. He attended some of my school events. He called on birthdays with reasonable regularity. He was capable of warmth in short concentrated bursts that were real even if they were insufficient. The problem was not that he was a monster, the problem was that he was a man who had organized his love hierarchically, and I was at the bottom of the hierarchy, and had known it since I was old enough to read a room. I went to college in Columbus on a combination of scholarships and loans. I studied finance. I graduated at 22, and went to work at an accounting firm. I was good at it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has found the work that fits the shape of their mind. By 23 I was making a salary that was modest but real. I had an apartment. I had a life. I had the beginning of something that was mine. My father called me when I was 23, not for my birthday, not for any occasion. He called because he needed something. He explained the situation with the efficiency of a man who had decided that context was unnecessary. He had made some investments that had not gone the way he had anticipated. He needed a bridge loan of $40,000. He would pay it back within 18 months. I was family and family helped each other. I was 23 years old with a modest salary, and student loans and an apartment I had furnished with things I had bought carefully over 2 years. I did not have $40,000. I told him this. He told me I could get it. I told him I was not able to do that. He told me that if I refused I was showing him who I really was. I told him I was showing him exactly who I was. A 23-year-old who didn't have $40,000 and wouldn't have been able to give it to him even if she did, and he said the thing he said. I said you are dead to me and I meant it, and then he hung up. My mother called me that evening. She had heard from someone in the community. She said, "Mija, I'm so sorry," and I said, "I'm okay," and I was more okay than I expected to be, because the relationship I was losing had always been conditional in a way I had understood even when I was trying not to understand it. And there was a particular relief in the conditionality finally being stated directly rather than just felt. I cried once, that night, for the father I had needed and not had, for the version of him that had existed in concentrated bursts, and that I had spent 23 years trying to earn a longer version of. And then I got up the next morning and I went to work and I started building the life that was going to exist without him in it. 15 years is a long time. I want to give you the shape of those 15 years because they matter for what happened in Phoenix. At 25 I was promoted to senior associate. At 27 I passed my CPA exam. At 29 I made manager. At 32 I made partner at a firm in Atlanta where I had moved at 26 for a position that required relocating and that I had taken because I was exactly the kind of person who relocated when the opportunity was right and had no anchor keeping her in Columbus anymore. At 35 I left the firm and started my own financial consulting practice with 2 partners. We had 14 clients in the first year and 31 in the second. At 38, I was running a practice that was successful in a way that I had built entirely from my own effort, and my own decisions, and my own willingness to do the work. I owned an apartment in Atlanta that I had bought at 30. I had investments that I managed myself because I understood them better than anyone I would have hired. I had a life that was full and specific and entirely constructed by me. My mother had died at 61, a stroke, 3 years before the Phoenix call, and I had been with her at the end the way she had always been with me, completely and without reservation, and her death had left a particular kind of grief that I had learned to carry without it changing the shape of everything else. She was the person who had taught me that love without conditions was possible, and I had built my life around that lesson. I had not spoken to my father in 15 years. I had thought of him occasionally the way you think of something that was once significant and is no longer present, with a detached acknowledgement of what it had been and what it had cost and what had been built in its absence. I did not miss him exactly. I missed the father I had needed, which was a different kind of missing, and I had learned to sit with that difference without needing to resolve it. The consultation room in the Phoenix hospital was small and beige with chairs that were slightly too low, and a table with a box of tissues on it that nobody had used. Marcus was 31, Jerome was 29. They had their father's height, and their mother's coloring and the particular expressions of men who had spent 3 days preparing for a conversation, and were now recalibrating because the person across from them was not who they had anticipated. I had met them twice, once at a family event when Marcus was 17, and I was 27, and my father and I were still technically in contact though the relationship was already faded to almost nothing. And once at my father's second wedding when Marcus was 4 and Jerome was 2 and I was 22, and doing the particular performance of a daughter who shows up to things even when showing up costs her something. They would not have remembered either encounter clearly, and I did not expect them to. Marcus had the folder open on the table before I had fully sat down. He was the talker. Jerome sat slightly behind him in the particular positioning of a second who has agreed to let someone else lead. Marcus said, "We are glad you came. We know it's been a long time. Dad is stable, but the doctors are saying recovery is going to be significant and he's going to need a lot of support. We've been here since Saturday, and we need to get back to our families. There are some decisions that need to be made about his care and his finances while he's incapacitated, and we need a family member who can be here longer term." I looked at the folder, I looked at Marcus, I said, "What's in the folder?" He said, "We had an attorney draw up some documents. A power of attorney for healthcare decisions and a financial power of attorney. We need someone with authority to manage Dad's accounts and make decisions about his care while he recovers. And since you're the oldest and you're here, we thought it made sense for you to sign these." I looked at the documents. I am a financial professional with 30 years of understanding how these instruments work. I read them with the attention I brought to every document placed in front of me. The healthcare POA was standard and reasonable. The financial POA was not. The financial POA, as drafted, gave me authority over my father's accounts with a co-signature requirement that was Marcus. It structured the financial decision-making in a way that required my agreement, but gave Marcus the ability to initiate transactions. It was not a document designed to protect my father. It was a document designed to use my signature as cover for decisions Marcus wanted to make. I set the documents on the table and I looked at Marcus and I said, "How long has your father been in Phoenix?" He looked at me. 3 years, he said. "How long has he lived in this specific condo?" "About 18 months. And before that?" "Various places," Marcus said. He moved around a bit. I nodded. I said, "I'd like to see his financial statements before I sign anything." Marcus's expression did the thing expressions do when a conversation has gone differently than planned. He said, "We don't really have access to those right now." I said, "Then I'd like to speak with his bank directly and with whatever attorney he has, if he has one, before I make any decisions about signing documents that were drafted by your attorney rather than his." Jerome shifted in his chair behind Marcus. Marcus looked at the folder, and I sat very still with my hands on the table and I thought, I know exactly what this is. I have seen this structure before in professional contexts, and I know exactly what it is designed to do. And I am the last person in this room who is going to sign it. I want to tell you what I did in the 48 hours after that consultation room, because it matters. I did not leave Phoenix. I got a hotel room 6 minutes from the hospital and I started working. I called a colleague in Atlanta who specialized in elder financial law and described the situation, and she said, "Do not sign anything until you have an independent attorney review everything," and I said, "I know. I need a referral in Phoenix." She gave me a name. I met with the Phoenix attorney, a woman named Sandra. The following morning, I brought the documents Marcus had given me. She read them and confirmed what I had assessed. The financial POA, as drafted, created a structure that would effectively give Marcus transaction initiation authority while using my signature as legal cover. She said, "This is not designed for your father's benefit," and I said, "I know, and I need to understand what his actual financial situation looks like." Sandra made calls. She had relationships with the hospital's patient advocate, and with the bank where my father held his primary accounts, as his emergency contact and the person named in his existing estate documents, which Sandra located through the county records. I had standing to request certain information. We used that standing carefully and thoroughly. What the financial picture showed was clarifying. My father had a pension from his engineering career that was modest but stable. He had a condo that was paid off and worth approximately $340,000. He had a brokerage account with a balance that had been significantly higher 18 months earlier, and had decreased steadily through a series of withdrawals over the previous 14 months, withdrawals that corresponded in timing to a pattern that Sandra described carefully and without making accusations she couldn't yet support, as consistent with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I sat with Sandra in her office and looked at 14 months of withdrawal records, and I thought about a man who had called me dead to him over $40,000, and I thought about his sons, who had been waiting in that consultation room for 3 days with a folder of documents, and I thought about 15 years of silence, and what it had contained. I went to see my father on the 3rd day. He had regained consciousness the previous evening and the doctors said he was stable and could have limited visitors. I stood in the doorway of his room for a moment before he saw me. He was smaller than I remembered, the particular smallness of illness, the body reduced to its essentials. The white hospital gown and the monitors and the hands that had always been large and certain now resting still on the blanket. He turned his head and saw me, and something moved across his face that I had not seen there in the concentrated bursts or anywhere else. It was not quite surprise, not quite relief, something older and quieter than either. "Nadia," he said, his voice hoarse from the intubation they had removed the previous day. I came in and sat in the chair beside his bed, and I looked at him for a moment and I said, "I'm here." He looked at the ceiling for a long time and then he said, "I kept your number." "I know," I said. "I always thought," he said, and then stopped. And I let him stop because I was not going to finish the sentence for him. He had 15 years of unfinished sentences, and they were his to complete, or leave unfinished, and I was not going to carry that for him. After a moment he said, "Your brothers came." "I know," I said, "they brought documents for me to sign." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "What kind of documents?" I told him, simply and specifically. I described the financial POA and its structure, and what it would have enabled. I watched his face while I described it, and what I saw there told me that he had not authorized those documents, that he had not known they existed, that whatever Marcus and Jerome had been doing in Phoenix for 3 days had not been done with his knowledge. "I should not have kept you away," he said, after a long silence. I looked at my father, this man who had told me I was dead to him over $40,000, who had maintained 15 years of silence while I built a life he knew nothing about, who had kept my number in his phone through all of it and listed me as his emergency contact for reasons I was only beginning to understand. "No," I said, "you shouldn't have," and I let that sit without softening it because he was a man who had always respected directness, and because the truth deserved to be said plainly. We talked for 40 minutes. It was not a reconciliation exactly. It was something more honest than that, 2 people assessing the damage of a long absence, and deciding what if anything could be built from what remained. He told me things he had not told me before. About the years after the divorce. About the second marriage. About the particular way he had organized his love that had left the people who needed it most with the least of it. He said things that were honest and insufficient, and I listened without filling the silences for him. Before I left I told him what I had found in the financial records. I told him about Sandra. I told him he needed his own attorney and I could help him find one if he wanted. He said yes. And in that yes was something I had not heard from him before, not quite humility, not quite trust, something between them that had the quality of a beginning. Marcus and Jerome left Phoenix 2 days after I met with Sandra. Marcus called me the morning he left and his voice had the particular quality of someone who has recalculated. He said he hoped I would keep them informed about their father's recovery and I said I would keep them informed of what was appropriate to share. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "We were just trying to help," and I said, "I know you believe that," and I left it there. Sandra filed a report with Adult Protective Services regarding the financial records. The investigation is ongoing. I am not the investigator, and it is not my case to prosecute. I provided what I had and Sandra took it from there. That is how these things are supposed to work and I trust the process, because I have seen it work when the right information reaches the right people at the right time. My father is recovering. He is in a rehabilitation facility in Phoenix. He will need assistance for several months, and we have discussed what that looks like in a way that is honest about what I can offer and what I cannot. I flew back to Atlanta 2 weeks after arriving. I have a practice to run and a life that exists and a father who is learning what it means to ask me for something in a way that acknowledges what asking costs. He called me last Sunday, no occasion, just called, and he asked how I was and he waited for the actual answer, and I gave it to him. And that was the most ordinary thing that had happened between us in 38 years, and I am choosing to treat it as what it might be, the beginning of something honest, late and imperfect and real. If you have been cut out of someone's life and then called back in when they needed something, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to go back. You are allowed to assess the situation with clear eyes. You are allowed to say no to what isn't right and yes to what is, and to do both of those things without guilt and without performing a forgiveness you haven't arrived at yet. Returning to a situation does not mean returning to who you were in it. You are allowed to walk back into a room as the person you have become rather than the person you were when you left. The $40,000 my father asked me for at 23 would have been a significant portion of everything I had. I said no, and he called me dead to him, and I spent 15 years proving that I was very much alive, more alive than I had been when I was trying to earn his concentrated bursts of warmth. And when he needed me, I went, because I am the kind of person who goes, not because he deserved it, because I am not the kind of woman who lets her father's worst decisions define her best ones. My name is Nadia, I'm 38 years old, and last Sunday my father called me with no occasion and asked how I was and waited for the real answer. It was the most ordinary thing, and it was everything. And I am going to be careful with it without being precious about it, because careful is what you are with things that are late and imperfect and might still be real. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And if no one has told you lately that going back is not the same as going back to who you were, I'm telling you now.